It's going to be just a bit of a chat this morning. He's got lots and lots of experience. So hopefully you're going to enjoy this and take something away from it. So Matthew, hello.
Hello. Hi, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh,
Hopefully
brilliant.
everyone else can as well.
Loud and clear.
Fantastic.
Amazing. Matthew, thank you so much for doing this. I know, like I said, you've got lots of experience talking. You've done so much, and hopefully people would have read the email yesterday and got a little bit of your backstory and what you've done. But just kind of, we want to spend a bit of time this morning really understanding what you've done in your journey and kind of how far you've come as well. I know you did a lot of activism from the late 80s all the way up to now. And I think this is what we're really keen to hear a little bit more of, a little bit about your journey. But in a nutshell, could you just kind of tell everyone who you are, what you've done, what you stand for, the usual?
Right, okay. So my name is Matthew. I'm a very old man. I'm 52 years old, which means I went to university in 1986. Now that was the same year that, actually, Section 28 was introduced in 1987. 1986 was when it started its journey going through Parliament. And at that point, I think because I'm probably older than most of the people in this class, I guess it's kind of just I wanted to talk a little bit about that history and kind of what it felt like to be around at that time. Because there were gay bars and it was all fine, and we kind of kept ourselves to ourselves mainly, or certainly that was my perception of it. That if we weren't bothered by the police, then we would just kind of try and be discreet. It was very common if you talk to someone that they definitely wouldn't be out to their family. They certainly wouldn't be out to anyone at work. Being gay was just quite a quiet thing for most people, not for everyone. And then Section 28 came along, and Section 28 was an amendment to the Local Government Act, which said that lesbian and gay lifestyles should not be promoted, our relationships should not be promoted as if they were family relationships, and that it was important that children should be taught that that our lives were not equally valid. Now, at that time, I wasn't particularly out, but that actually brought me out of the closet screaming with flags, because I felt like if I didn't stand up for my rights then I never would. And it was really important to make a stand. So I started doing protests against Section 28. I got arrested for a bit of civil disobedience I did, because the tabloids at that time were quite regularly just saying things like gays should be rounded up and put in concentration camps and gassed. It's hard to think now, when we've moved on so far, how terrible it was and how routine and commonplace homophobia was in those days. And it's brilliant that we've moved on a lot since then. So that's how I got started in activism. There was an activist group called Outrage that actually didn't begin until after Section 28 had passed into law. And I was a founder member of that. And we used to do protests like kiss-ins and often it was very visual protests just to get attention going. And at Outrage, I always say it worked as a pincer movement with Stonewall. Stonewall was like kind of the nice people in suits, and they'd go and have tea with John Major, and they would try and get the law changed. Whereas Outrage would be painting graffiti on things and blocking traffic and doing those kinds of civil disobedience actions. And the two of them together, Outrage meant that people needed to act, and Stonewall gave the politicians an opportunity to act. And I think it was through the two of those together that we enjoy many of the equalities that we enjoy now.
Yeah, amazing. It's really interesting you talking about Section 28. So I think Sam and I, being born in the early 80s, and we started school in 1987, 1988, and so we were kind of the children of the late 80s and 90s who really also kind of felt were at the forefront of Section 28, because you weren't able to discuss homosexuality at school. So as a young gay child, and I've known I was gay since a very young age, to have no one talking about that around you, to feel so alienated, and also, it just meant that even if people use gay as a slur, in types of gay bullying, things like that, teachers weren't really allowed to get involved because they weren't allowed to talk about it. And that was kind of the impact of Section 28. And we do talk about this generation of people now who were at school in the 80s and 90s who really missed out on that support of being comfortable with who you are, and kind of the effect that has on your mental health. And it's one of the reasons why we do find that mental health problems and issues are more rife within the community.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it wasn't that we had kind of great LGBT education before Section 28. What Section 28 did was it enshrined that homophobia in law. And I think that then when Section 28 was finally repealed in the UK, in England in 2003, I mean, it's amazing to think that it's actually less than 20 years ago. But it meant that it's established in law that actually LGBT people weren't inferior, we weren't lesser. And then I think when we got equal marriage, I mean, to be honest, I wasn't enormously fighting for equal marriage because I got myself civilly partnered. And I thought, oh, that's equivalent to marriage. And it was only when David Cameron, the Prime Minister, said it's no longer right that lesbians and gays should have a second-class form of marriage. And I was like, oh, it's second class. I hadn't realized. I wouldn't have spent so much on the reception if I'd known. So after he said that, it's like, oh God, now I've got to start fighting for equal marriage as well. Great. But when it did happen, it was fantastic because, you know, you could go to those, well, okay, so an example. My husband was asking for leave at a very busy time, and he was told by his boss, well, you know, it's not like you're married. He was civilly partnered at the time. So people weren't thinking that civil partnerships were the same as marriage. And so when we did get married, when we were able to convert our civil partnership to a marriage, and you're chatting to some aging aunt and you just go, blah, 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 my husband. And you can see that look in her face of like, and you're like, it's law. It's law now. You can't even argue with me about it.
Yeah. Amazing. Just kind of quickly as well, obviously today was supposed to be London Pride. Obviously it's cancelled because of the current pandemic. But you've been involved in Pride since you were very young. What was your first Pride like?
So my first Pride was in 1986, so the year you went to school. Thanks for making me feel really old. But you always do, so that's fine. So 1986, and I think at that time there was, I don't know, I mean, the numbers may be wrong, but my memory of it was there was about 20,000 people. And at the time, you know, as a 18-year-old boy, I was just like, I've never seen so many wonderful, hot LGBT people in my life. And it was like incredibly exciting. It's bizarre now to think that we now regularly get like 600,000 people, not this year, but, you know, last year, get about 600,000 people lining the streets. It used to be that everyone who was LGBT actually marched. I mean, that was the thing. You all went on the march. Now, if every LGBT person who wanted to march marched, it would take 3 days to walk past and no one would be watching by the time you get to the end, because believe me, I've been at the end of that march and it is dull as. So that's why they're now limited on who's actually able to march, because there's too many of us. But I mean, God, what an amazing thing that is.
Yeah. I was watching your wonderful AIDS Map cast that you did on Thursday night, and you touched on that. And Matthew does this. If you follow Matthew, you'll see that he does a lot of work within his business as well. So if you follow him, you'll see exactly when he does his talks. But you mentioned in there, which like the point that I was really kind of interested in, was although we, you know, every week or every month we hear amazing things that are happening within our community, there's also lots of things happening around the world that we should be really concerned about. And you mentioned about your fear of what could potentially happen in the future, and in particular, how much you think corporate businesses, it would be interesting to see how many of them would stick with us, like they do with Pride, if things were to change. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful where we are in the UK in terms of LGBT equality, and I think we should really celebrate that. And I think that Pride is a celebration now of all that we have achieved. At the same time, we have to recognize that things aren't the same all around the world, and that while we see advances in LGBT equality, I mean, so in the last couple of weeks, the Supreme Court in the United States actually passed a measure they acknowledged that the employment protection, which was already granted to people, extended to lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people. So basically, you can't be fired for being LGBT in the US anymore. which is, considering the current state of the administration in the US, you have to go, well, that was a surprise, but a pleasant one. And in Gabon, they have recently voted down a statute, which they actually only passed last year, which further criminalized homosexual acts between men and between women. So these are wonderful examples of progress. And yet there are 73 countries in the world which still criminalize sexual acts between men or sexual acts between women. In Uganda, it can be punishable by life imprisonment. In some Middle Eastern countries, it is still punishable by death. We have seen progress in the wrong direction recently. Trans rights have been eroded in Hungary and in Puerto Rico. The person who is the incumbent president in Poland he's running for re-election. Oh, it's like any moment now. And he has said that if he is re-elected, he will introduce a clause which is very similar to Section 28, banning any promotion of homosexuality. And I was talking to a colleague in Poland on Thursday. And I said, well, what's it like for you? He's a queer man. And he said, it really hasn't been so bad up until quite recently, but just the last 2 months, the feelings of hatred and fear and anger which is being directed against LGBT is increasing, and it's making him feel incredibly unsafe. You look at what's happening in Brazil. Brazil is one of the most kind of vibrant, carnival and all of that. It's kind of very, very, in lots of respects, very LGBT friendly. But the amount of trans women who are murdered in Brazil each year almost equals the amount of trans people who are murdered around the world elsewhere. And in the UK, there is the Gender Recognition Act, which is currently going through. Now, under Theresa May, we were promised that the Gender Recognition Act was actually going to ease some of the challenges that trans people face around asserting their identity. There's things about making it much easier for them to change their birth certificate and their passport, which trans people find incredibly stressful. And so this was meant to be really good news. But Liz Truss, who is the Minister for Equalities, she has hinted that actually they're going to use this bill to restrict trans people's freedoms. So it's very worrying. And I've done a lot of work on LGBT history in my life. I've curated an exhibition at the Museum of London about lesbian and gay life throughout London's history. And I think it's really important that everyone is aware that what we see in terms of LGBT equality is not one single straight path towards equality, but there are bumps and twists and turns and curves in that road. And so it's really important that, for LGBT people and for our allies to continue to fight for LGBT rights, because these things are not given, they're not certain. And so when I see Barclays or Sainsbury's or Tesco's or whoever festoon themselves with rainbow flags, I think this is fantastic. It's brilliant. I think it's wonderful that these enormous organizations which kind of control our country to a large extent are completely behind LGBT rights, and I think it's brilliant, and I'm not at all against the corporate sponsorship of Pride, because you need the cash. And also, I think it's really good that people know I can go and get a job at Barclays or whatever, and I know that I can be an out and proud LGBT person and not face prejudice. What is really important, though, is if we have introduced into law restrictions on the freedom of trans people, which may well come with the Gender Recognition Act in the next couple of months, if they try to introduce what is often referred to as a religious freedom bill, which they have been doing in the US. Now, that sounds like, oh, well, religious freedom, that's good. But if that freedom is freedom to discriminate against LGBT people in the workplace or in the provision of goods and services, or if they introduce one of those bills which is akin to Section 28, and because of what's happening in Birmingham, I think this is quite likely. There have been Dominic Raab and Priti Patel within the cabinet have actually already started arguing in favor of this, that parents should have the right to determine the kind of sex education that their child receives on the basis that, oh, well, of course, parents know best, but parents don't always know best, because if you're a young LGBT child, as Ash was saying, if you're a young LGBT child, you need to know at school that you are valid, that you are loved, that you are perfect just as you are. And I want to know that those corporates who are saying that they fully support Pride will continue to support LGBT people when the going gets tough.
Brilliant. Right, we've run out of time. There was more that I'd love to have spoken about, but yeah, I think you kind of hit everything on the head.
I do apologise. I just rabbit on, you know, just like put a coin in the back of me and off I go. I'm really sorry about that.
No, it was amazing. And everything you said is exactly the reason why we chose Kaleidoscope Trust as our charity of choice for today. They do amazing work helping LGBT activists in all around the world, but in particular in countries where there are minimal or no laws and protections of LGBT people. So we're going to raise some amazing money today for that, and just know that we're all in it together. But Matthew, thank you so much.
Two garments Chinese, red carpet TV, valet my limousine. Head to toe, let your whole body talk. Happy young man, YMCA, it's fun.
Your choice.
We will love the beach. Life is peaceful there.
Well, back down. Whatever you've done today, turning up to this, for example, that's one thing you've done today that is good for you.
Matthew, hello.
Hello. Hi, can everyone hear me? I mean, it's wonderful where we are in the UK in terms of LGBT equality, and I think we should really celebrate that. And I think that Pride is a celebration now of all that we have achieved. At the same time, we have to recognize that things aren't the same all around the world, and yet there are 73 countries in the world which still criminalize sexual acts between men or sexual acts between women. And so it's really important that, you know, for LGBT people and for our allies to continue to fight for LGBT rights, because these things are not given, they're not certain.
And Pride, these kind of things are amazing, but Pride did start as a protest, and it still is a protest. As Matthew touched on earlier, we've made lots of progress, but there's still a lot more work to be done. If you're not aware, it was Black trans people who were the forefront of the modern gay rights movement, and every gay person that you know owe a lot to that community. So it's time for us to stand up for them. So love you all.